Woman spots strange blue birds' eggs. She's shocked when they hatch 10 days later. It was an early spring morning, and the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the quiet neighborhood. The air was crisp, and the first songs of the birds filled the stillness. Sarah Thompson, a 32-year-old woman who had recently moved into the neighborhood, was out in her garden sipping a cup of coffee and enjoying the peaceful start to her day. She had always loved the outdoors, finding comfort in the simple beauty of nature. Her garden, though small, was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the stresses of everyday life. As she wandered through the rows of newly planted flowers, something unusual caught her eye. In a low-hanging branch of an old oak tree at the edge of her yard, she noticed a nest. At first, it seemed like any other bird's nest, but when she stepped closer, she realized that it wasn't just any nest. Inside were 3 small, perfectly round eggs, each a brilliant shade of blue, unlike any she had ever seen before. The color was striking, almost unnatural, and it immediately piqued her curiosity. Sarah leaned in closer, carefully examining the eggs. They were smooth, almost glossy, and had a faint, iridescent sheen that glimmered in the morning light. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of bird could have laid such unusual eggs. She had seen her fair share of bird nests before, but none had ever contained eggs like these. Her mind raced with possibilities. Were they from some exotic bird, blown off course and seeking refuge in her garden? Or perhaps they were from a species she had never encountered before. Welcome to PlotTwister. Before we unravel today's mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you're always in the loop. Unable to tear herself away from the mysterious sight, Sarah decided she needed to know more. She went inside, grabbing her phone to do a quick search online, hoping to find some answers. But no matter what she searched, nothing matched the strange blue eggs in her backyard. Frustrated but intrigued, she knew she had stumbled upon something out of the ordinary. As she returned to the garden, the mystery of the blue eggs weighed on her mind. Little did she know those eggs would soon lead her on a journey unlike anything she could have imagined. From that day on, Sarah's morning routine changed. Every day she would check on the nest, carefully approaching it with a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. The eggs remained the same, their vivid blue color still as mesmerizing as the first time she saw them. Each day felt like a countdown to something unknown, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a growing attachment to the tiny fragile lives inside those eggs. The days passed uneventfully at first, with Sarah keeping a close watch on the nest. She noticed that no adult bird seemed to be around, which puzzled her. Most nests she'd seen before had a vigilant parent nearby, protecting their eggs. But these eggs were different. They sat alone in the nest, exposed to the elements, and Sarah began to worry about their survival. She wondered if the mother bird had abandoned them, but the eggs seemed healthy, their vibrant color showing no signs of fading. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, the weather took a sudden turn. Dark clouds gathered overhead, and the wind picked up, rustling the trees in her backyard. Within minutes, a heavy storm rolled in, bringing with it sheets of rain and flashes of lightning. Sarah's thoughts immediately went to the nest. She stood by the window, helplessly watching as the rain poured down on her garden, wondering if the eggs would make it through the night. The next morning, as soon as the rain stopped, Sarah rushed outside, her heart pounding with worry. The garden was drenched, and the branches of the oak tree dropped under the weight of the water. But to her relief, the nest was still there, and the eggs were intact. They looked even more vibrant, their blue hue somehow deeper against the damp nest. But there was something else. Were the eggs slightly bigger than before? Sarah couldn't be sure, but it added another layer to the growing mystery. Sarah couldn't keep the discovery to herself any longer. She mentioned the strange eggs to her neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, an avid birdwatcher who had lived in the area for decades. But even Mrs. Jenkins was baffled. She had never seen anything like them in all her years of watching birds. This only deepened the enigma, leaving Sarah more intrigued and anxious than ever as she continued her watchful wait. 10 days after she first discovered the nest, Sarah woke up with an unusual sense of anticipation. As she went about her morning routine, a feeling she couldn't quite explain kept pulling her toward the garden. She quickly finished her coffee and stepped outside. The cool morning air brushed against her face. When she reached the oak tree, her breath caught in her throat. One of the eggs had a tiny crack. Heart racing, Sarah leaned in closer, eyes wide with excitement and disbelief. She could hear faint, almost imperceptible sounds coming from within the egg, tiny pecks against the shell. The moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. She stood there completely still, not wanting to miss a single second of what was happening. The crack widened slowly and a tiny beak appeared, chipping away at the shell. Sarah watched in awe as the first chick struggled to break free, its small body twisting and pushing against the confines of the egg. When the chick finally emerged, Sarah gasped. It was unlike any bird she had ever seen. The chick's feathers were vivid, almost neon blue, shimmering in the early morning light. The patterns of its feathers were intricate, almost as if they had been painted by hand. This wasn't just any bird. This was something extraordinary. Before Sarah could fully process what she was seeing, the second egg began to crack. She couldn't tear her eyes away as the second chick made its entrance into the world, equally as strange and beautiful as the first. The two chicks, barely minutes old, seemed to recognize each other instantly. They chirped softly, a sound that was both familiar and foreign, and nuzzled close together as if drawn by an invisible bond. A mix of emotions swirled in Sarah's chest: wonder, excitement, and a touch of fear. These chicks were no ordinary birds. Their unusual color, their behavior, everything about them felt otherworldly. As she watched them, a realization began to dawn on her. These birds might not belong in her garden or anywhere she could easily explain. But whatever they were here now, and they needed her. Sarah's mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear. She couldn't look away. The mystery of the blue eggs had taken a stunning turn, and she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to find out more about these strange, vibrant chicks. The sight of them was so unusual that she knew she had to get some answers. After all, she had never seen or heard of birds like this before. Without wasting any time, she picked up her phone and called the local wildlife center, describing the situation as best she could. The person on the other end of the line was intrigued, asking her several questions before finally deciding to send someone over to take a look. Later that day, Dr. Emily Harris, a wildlife expert, arrived at Sarah's home. Sarah led her to the garden, her heart pounding with both excitement and anxiety. Dr. Harris approached the nest carefully, her trained eyes narrowing as she studied the chicks. She crouched down, examining the vibrant feathers and the chicks' unusual behavior. The more she looked, the more her expression shifted from curiosity to deep concentration. Dr. Harris took out her phone, snapping a few photos and taking notes. She explained that she'd never seen anything quite like these birds before. Their coloration, their patterns, even their behavior. It was all highly unusual. She mentioned that she would need to run some tests and do more research to understand what these birds were, but she admitted that it might take some time. The birds didn't match any species she was familiar with, which left both her and Sarah with more questions than answers. As the days passed, Sarah continued to care for the chicks, who were growing rapidly. They began to explore their surroundings, hopping around the nest and even venturing onto nearby branches. But their behavior only added to the mystery. They seemed almost too intelligent for such young birds. They mimicked sounds they heard in the garden, and their feathers would flash different shades of blue, as if communicating with each other in a language Sarah couldn't understand. Days went by with no word from Dr. Harris, and Sarah's concern grew. She wondered if these birds were safe in her backyard, or if they belonged somewhere far from the world she knew. Then one afternoon, her phone rang. It was Dr. Harris, and there was something in her voice that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. The expert asked her to come to the wildlife center as soon as possible. Sarah agreed, her mind racing with possibilities, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. Sarah arrived at the wildlife center with a mix of excitement and nervousness swirling in her chest. As she walked through the door, she was greeted by Dr. Harris, who wore a serious expression that immediately put Sarah on edge. Without wasting any time, Dr. Harris led Sarah to a quiet room where they could talk privately. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, and Sarah could feel her heart racing as she waited to hear what the expert had discovered. Dr. Harris began by explaining that she had spent the last few days consulting with colleagues and diving deep into records and research. The findings were startling. The birds in Sarah's backyard were not just rare, they were possibly the last of their kind. Dr. Harris showed Sarah a series of old documents and illustrations, some of which were centuries old, depicting birds with similar features. These birds, she explained, were thought to have been extinct for hundreds of years. The vivid blue feathers, the intricate patterns, and even the behavior Sarah had noticed all pointed to a species that had long been lost in history. As Dr. Harris spoke, Sarah's mind struggled to keep up with the gravity of what she was hearing. The chicks she had been caring for weren't just unusual, they were a living connection to a world that no longer existed. These birds were incredibly valuable, not just in terms of their rarity, but in what they could teach the scientists about the past and how ecosystems have changed over time. But the revelation also brought with it a heavy responsibility. Dr. Harris explained that these birds couldn't stay in Sarah's backyard. They needed to be in a controlled environment, a sanctuary where they could be protected and studied. Their survival was crucial, not just for their own sake, but for the potential they held in helping to restore a species that was thought to be gone forever. Sarah felt a deep pang of sadness at the thought of letting them go, but she understood the importance of what Dr. Harris was saying. The conversation left Sarah with a lot to process. She had discovered something truly extraordinary, but it also meant that the birds she had grown so attached to would soon be taken to a place where they could be cared for better. As she left the wildlife center, her thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. Pride in what she had found, sadness at the impending farewell, and a deep sense of wonder at the mystery that had unfolded in her own backyard. Back home, Sarah felt an emptiness in her garden. The nest, once the center of her attention, now seemed lonely without the vibrant chicks that had filled her days with wonder. The decision to let them go weighed heavily on her heart, but she knew it was the right thing to do. The birds needed more than she could provide. They needed to be somewhere safe where their survival could help preserve a species thought to be lost forever. The next few days were a blur of emotions. Sarah kept busy in her garden trying to fill the void left by the birds, but every corner of her yard reminded her of them. The branch where the nest had sat, the sounds of the chirping, and the sight of their dazzling blue feathers. She missed them more than she expected, and the garden that had once been her sanctuary now felt strangely empty. Then one afternoon, just as she was beginning to adjust to their absence, her phone rang. It was Dr. Harris, and her voice was filled with excitement. The birds were doing exceptionally well at the sanctuary. Not only had they adapted to their new environment, but they also had started displaying behaviors that suggested they might be ready to breed. This was incredible news. These birds weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Dr. Harris invited Sarah to visit the sanctuary, and without hesitation, she agreed. A few days later, Sarah found herself driving to the sanctuary, her heart pounding with anticipation. When she arrived, she was led to an enclosure filled with lush greenery and the sounds of other rare birds. And there in the middle of it all were the chicks, now fully fledged, their blue feathers even more vibrant than she remembered. They seemed happy, flitting from branch to branch, exploring their new home with confidence. Seeing them like this, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She knew she made the right decision. The birds were exactly where they needed to be, and their future looked bright. As she was about to leave, Dr. Harris handed her a small framed photograph. It was a picture of the chicks in their nest, taken just before they were moved to the sanctuary. It was a gift, a reminder of the incredible journey they had shared. Driving home, Sarah couldn't help but smile. She had played a part in something truly special, and though she missed the birds, she knew they were safe. The garden that had once felt empty now seemed full of memories and possibilities. And as she walked through it that evening, she realized that sometimes letting go is the greatest act of love. What are your thoughts on the twist we uncovered today? Comment your ideas below. Make sure to like and subscribe for a daily dose of drama and mystery. See you later with another twist.